Welcome to Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John.
Hey, John.
How are you, Ed?
I'm well, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. So today we're going to talk about technology and how we can possibly use it to close the loop between sales and marketing and customer service, as we've been talking about throughout this series. I don't know about you, Ed, but I think about technology today as really innovation. And we usually think about that in terms of hardware and software that makes our lives better, or maybe in some cases worse, like our iPhones or Netflix. But back in Thomas Paine's day, there were plenty of innovations going on then as well. And one of the ones I like to think about is the way we fought that war with the British. You know, when we first started out, we were trying to emulate the British and use these conventional line of battle tactics in which, you know, you would line up your troops and march them out on a field, and then you'd be facing off against another line of the enemy. And, you know, you'd trade shots back and forth until, you know, everyone was dead or somebody turned and ran, you know, which was a pretty crazy way to fight a war. And we had no hope of ever winning that way. We were outmanned, we were outgunned and outtrained, and really everything else was on the side of the British. But as the war evolved, we started to really learn about how to get smart about that. And we started fighting more of a guerrilla war, complete with IEDs and behind the lines sabotage, you know, all the kinds of things you'd see today in asymmetrical wars that are fought around the world today. So that change of tactic worked really well for us, and eventually we prevailed over the British. So what kinds of technology are needed, you know, in a battle between businesses today? What kinds of technology can we bring to the battlefield to help us survive?
Well, let's use a sports analogy. We're in the middle of the Winter Olympics right now as you and I are chatting. And so it's really interesting to see the way technology impacts athletic performance. And, you know, it's not like somebody puts a jetpack on their back. Technology is an enabler. So there's technology that helps with nutrition and strength training and aerodynamic clothing and all kinds of incremental small bits of technology that will help an athlete achieve more. But at the same time, the athlete's got to do it. None of it does it for the athlete or on behalf of the athlete. They've got to be well conditioned and strong and fiercely determined and all that. So technology helps. And it's just the same in business. You know, people think that somehow you implement a CRM system and somehow that makes the business better. Well, no, all it is an enabler. And you can go down a long list of technology, whether it's CRM or marketing automation or chatbots or AI or ticketing and knowledge base and all these kinds of things. But just as you see with the athlete, they have to do the work. It's the same kind of thing with content marketing. If you don't have a solid strategy, all you're doing is just producing content. You're not fixing the underlying issue. So really the key is to make sure that you understand what you're solving for with technology or what you expect technology to help you improve at. And when you sit down with a client to take them through that process, John, how do you do it? Where do you start, and how do you help them visualize what technology could do and how they go about picking it?
Well, I think as you mentioned, you know, really the problem most companies have, and as a result, they get turned off to technology sometimes, is that they dive straight into it without doing that research and planning that you were talking about. And, you know, there are literally thousands of software applications and platforms out there that are available just for sales, marketing, and customer service these days. So, you know, diving in is a non-starter. You really need to do your homework, and it really needs to work. Otherwise, you're going to be investing a bunch of time and effort and budget on something that's ultimately going to fail, and you don't want to do that. So what we like to do is take it in steps. So the key themes, you know, what are you looking at? How are you solving for the buyer? All of those strategic questions need to be figured out first. and what technology specifically will help you accomplish that interim goal. And then at some stage, we need to put those pieces together. So we might start with the website, taking a sort of an assessment of how well your website's working. What are you doing in social media? Are you blogging? Do you have other web-based resources that are effective? And how effective are they? What kind of measurements have you been taking to look at the traffic and the leads and the return visits and the overall performance of those assets? Then the next level is really taking a look at how well they work for your buyers. And there are a number of different ways of doing that. You can ask them, for one thing. You can do surveys. You can do questionnaires. You can do a variety of different things, including measuring how they interact with your website to see how well it works. And then ultimately, you want to see that success translated down through your buyer journey, through the sales funnel. You want to see how well it impacts marketing's goals, customer services goals, and ultimately sales goals. So once you've started out with that and just taken that snapshot and then made some assessment of what to do next, the next step is logically building that framework. So sitting down in a room for however long it takes with the stakeholders in the chain, you know, the web developers, the designers, the strategists, the sales people, the customer service reps, and some of their management team. And ultimately reaching out to buyers, of course, too, to put together that framework and figure out what is that plan, that roadmap going forward. So one of the things that doesn't work is if your leadership team isn't 100% on board with this and committed to that change. So it's not going to do you any good to sit down and go through this exercise unless they're completely committed to making the changes that are suggested at the end of the day. You know, they're going to have their chance, and the IT department and other people involved are going to have a chance to react to the recommendations and make their own changes as needed. But ultimately, you got to get everybody on board or it's just not going to work. So where do you see companies struggling with justifying and committing to those changes?
So again, to build on the Olympics analogy, one of the things that I think is really cool to understand is how technology is being used as a coaching tool. So it's not just technology that helps the athlete do more, but how can high-speed video or complex kind of biomechanical engineering systems be used to help athletes understand how to find those little edges? And I think a similar thing happens with technology in companies. They tend to think of technology as being the fix. And again, it's just an enabler. So part of what it does is enables a better solution for the buyer, as you said. But a huge piece that's often missed is understanding how technology can enable the coaching and the management and the improvement of internal processes. It's a big opportunity to improve sales performance that often gets missed. It can also help companies to reverse engineer the ideal customer profile or even the messaging and the marketing and sales approach. They can use technology to get a lot more insight into what works and what doesn't work. And so then they can obviously do more or less accordingly based on what they're seeing. So the tech stack needs to be not just kind of a real-time tool for contact management, but an engine for improvement. And when people just kind of grab these ad hoc apps, that's a huge piece that gets missed. So when that's the mindset, you know, companies can use it to drive revenue, but also use it to enhance valuation because they're going to build IP. They're going to build processes. They're going to have more accurate forecasting. They're going to have better reporting. They're going to have revenue growth teams that are efficient, that have a replicable process and follow this consistent model and codify it into IP that becomes a strategic asset for them and supports the scalable growth. So I think that understanding technology as not just a fix, but a window and a tool, a window into performance and how to improve performance is where companies have a big opportunity to kind of miss it or they seize that opportunity. But that's theory. And one of the things that you help do is help companies take this theory around technology and turn it into practice. And I know that you've seen successes and failures, and we can learn from both of those. So give us some of those kind of anecdotes to help us understand what you've seen that works.
Well, it's interesting. It can be very successful if everybody gets it, as you've been talking about, and there is that commitment. But I think it's more illustrative to look at the failures, to just get an idea of how not to go down this road. So let's assume that now that at some level, the leadership team understands the value of technology, as you've talked about, and the effectiveness that it can deliver. And then they decide, well, let's try an experiment. And I've worked with a couple of multi-billion-dollar industrial conglomerates in recent years on this very scenario where they've said, you know what, I want to try out this digital marketing because I've heard it can work. Some of our competitors are trying it out, and we want to just see how far we can get with this. So that's the mindset. There isn't any real commitment to this. It's just that there's a commitment to an experiment. So, they're starting out with we're going to do this pilot, and they've never had any experience with it. And they're still depending on, in most cases, direct sales and partner channels to generate new business. So this is a completely new way of looking at sales from the buyer point of view. And they've heard about
it's amazing how shocking that sounds, but it's true.
Yeah.
A new way of thinking about sales from the buyer point of view. Imagine that.
And maybe they've heard about inbound marketing and content marketing and digital advertising, and they just think that there's a way to shortcut that and to dive in and get that done. But the problems arise because there isn't a plan. Maybe they bring a consultant in like myself, or an agency, or a couple of consultants like you and me, and they map out maybe a pilot program, and they're actually paying for it and all that sort of thing. So there is a commitment. But it needs to go further than that. There needs to be a commitment for all of the stakeholders to take part in the pilot and to do what they're supposed to do. So examples are, roadblocks that are put up by IT because the technology you need to use is not something compatible with their legacy systems. Or maybe the legal department stonewalls any content that you want to put out there because it doesn't meet their compliance, or they're just nervous about trying something different. And then another problem that happens all the time is that the human resources that get assigned to the project get reassigned somewhere else right in the middle of it. So you may lose your champion within the project, or just key support people. So all of this happens fairly frequently, and the result is that in our case, we were able to get a few campaigns done that did demonstrate success, but it wasn't enough to really overcome the resistance that's out there to change, and especially when it comes to things like technology and a new way of doing sales and knocking down barriers. There's really no appetite for that, and so it fails, and it's a trap because it's tempting for companies to want to do this in a tentative way and just sort of get started and see what the problems are. But then what happens is that, once it's a failure, it just, goes off the budget plan for the next 5 years, and you're losing a bunch of valuable time.
Right.
So what can you do about that resistance to change?
Well, from a technology perspective, often the resistance comes because companies have invested money in technology. They've done it in this, not built on a foundation of strategy and understanding the buyer that you're describing, but kind of heard about an app, said, oh, that solves a problem we think we have, let's buy it. And it just doesn't get used. People complain about it. People refuse to use it. And often you can look at a core function in a company like the accounting software or the ERP, and people may hate it and it may be awkward, but they've got no choice. they have to use it. For a lot of the kind of technology that we're talking about, it's something that, somebody can almost with impunity just ignore. And they can always use the excuse, oh, well, I'm too busy. I mean, you hear that all the time. And companies have even gotten almost painted themselves into a corner because they try to be very thoughtful and deliberate about resources and making sure that they're using resources carefully. But that becomes a double-edged sword, because when somebody doesn't want to work with a new software, or they don't want to commit to really understanding how to track digital marketing performance, they can always say, oh, well, we don't have enough resources to be working on it. And so that becomes almost a bulletproof argument. How can somebody argue with that after you've told them they need to be planning on resources? So for the sales rep, they would rather just focus on calling leads and doing stuff the way they've traditionally done it. And they don't want to learn a CRM because that's not putting money in their pocket. It takes them out of the field and all that kind of stuff. It's a tough situation. Companies balk at the price as well. And one of the things that, on the one hand, this profusion of SaaS applications that solve problems that we never even knew we had, and give us tremendous insight and capability, also means that where companies didn't really have much of a marketing and sales software budget, most of the software budget was elsewhere in the organization. Now they didn't have much of a budget for it to begin with, and now we're piling all these new applications, that are coming out fast and furious on them, and saying, oh, well, this one's only $50 a month per user. This one's only $2,000 a year. And incrementally, those don't sound like a lot of money, but very quickly you get to the point where the price is an impediment. Security often gets raised as a concern. And this is a red herring, because the reality is that for SaaS companies, and most of the technology we're talking about is SaaS stuff, for SaaS companies, they have to have bulletproof security. I mean, a SaaS company won't survive some sort of an incident where they've got a security problem. And yet the IT company or the IT department in a company will often be scrambling, trying to address phishing attacks and ransomware. I mean, I've seen clients that literally have shut down their systems for 3 days because of ransomware, and they're worried. They think they've got great internal security. They're worried about a SaaS product because they're worried about outsourcing the security to somebody else. So security is often misunderstood, or that's used as an argument, really without much validity. So you solve for these things, John, with your approach. You pick the technology based on a framework. You work with the leadership team to make sure the decisions have buy-in. You go through all that process, and not just some kind of an experiment. You build a budget that's founded in strategy and solving for the buyer, and you know how to overcome the silos and all that kind of stuff. But you come to a point still where you have to, maybe you don't call it an experiment, but you're doing some sort of a phased approach, because companies won't just say, oh, we're going to throw out everything we've done and completely change. So given that you need to kind of gradually introduce it, how do you build a roadmap that envisions everything you need to do in the future, but phases it in a way that doesn't temper the commitment, but makes it a manageable implementation process?
Well, that's a great point. I think, you have to be organized about the way you get into these projects, and take them a step at a time so that you start to build buy-in. And I would start with a brainstorm session or a workshop. It could be a day long, couple days, however long you think it takes, depending on the size and complexity of your organization. But the key thing is to invite all of the stakeholders, all the users, and their bosses who will have a hand in deciding what to do and how to do it. And it's really not a good idea to just invite the management team, because then you don't have buy-in from the users. And you really want to make sure the power users, the ones who are really sort of driving the process forward at each level, those people are involved, because they'll be the ones that resist, like you said, if they're forced to do something that they don't think is either a smart way to do it or is just too much effort. So let's start with that workshop. Let's make sure we all agree on the mission. What are we trying to accomplish here with the technology stack, with the change? with the process we're going to change and all the steps moving forward. Those are the kind of the outcomes of that first workshop that really are important to set out, exactly what we're going to do and when, and how will we know what success is at the end of the day. So it has to be a well-led, well-organized. It has to have a clear agenda so that there isn't, you're not getting into a big shouting match about this works and that doesn't work and we tried that. Those sorts of things aren't particularly helpful. After the session is over, then you have this roadmap. You're going to start executing it. Certain people are going to start earlier than others. You can plan all of that out so that the whole organization isn't just tied up in this experiment. And you're going to want some sort of oversight committee to make sure that things are getting done. So, involving a member of each one of those sections or departments in your oversight committee is also important, so it doesn't seem like politics. So the next thing is really moving forward, committing to it, sticking to it, making it a priority. Sometimes that's really hard, but if you don't do that, you're pretty much doomed to failure because other people have other priorities. So you want to make sure that people are incentivized to participate, and one way to do that is to include results and participation and meeting milestones as part of the actual work expectations for your employees. So get HR involved as well and set goals and roadmaps and timelines that actually tie into employee performance. That's a great way to make sure things get done. And then really ultimately, don't forget about the measurement process. So really setting up those key performance indicators, those metrics, those milestones, and then measuring those things to make sure you've accomplished them by the time that you set up in the roadmap. And you can use technology for that too. So that should be part of your thinking. So we've been talking about putting the stack together, putting the strategy together, and working on the foundations of sales and marketing and customer service, like CRM, marketing automation, and some of the other basic technologies. People get excited about the new stuff, though. What are some of the other things we can do with technology that people may not have thought of?
So there's some that we know today that may be kind of relatively unusual and developing. Obviously, the things that we'll do with technology in 5 years, who knows? I mean, we're talking about designing drugs for a specific individual, just kind of automatically on the fly. And who knows what the application will be to sales and marketing. But some of the things that we know about today, let's take trade shows, for instance. I mean, trade shows are a fundamental piece of the industrial sales and marketing game. The problem is that companies are still doing trade shows the way they've always done them. And so they've got opportunities to take technology and really disrupt their trade show activities using beacons, using apps, even using more kind of familiar technology like marketing automation and landing pages, integrating them with what they're doing in the booth to give visitors and buyers and prospects a much better experience in the booth. AR ties in with that. AR is potentially huge in a number of different areas of sales and marketing. Certainly trade shows are one. All you got to do is look at how Lego uses it in toy stores for kids to help them visualize what the kit looks like when it's done. I mean, imagine doing that, visualizing how your business improves if you implement our solution. Data and ties in obviously with AI. You got to have a large volume of data in order to do some of the AI stuff. And it crosses over really from how it helps us sell to a foundation as an asset, strategic asset, and other revenue streams and other business models that can come out of the data, the accumulation of data, the analysis of data, the AI that ties in with it. So it's not just about using AI for marketing, as more and more people are talking about, but how can we use that data as actually as a foundation for new products and new revenue streams. And along the lines of data, buyer intent data is something that isn't getting a lot of attention. for all of the discussion about how to improve more traffic to your site and better conversions on your site and better experience for buyers through that, if you look at it statistically, companies may convert, if they rank well in search, maybe they convert a click-through rate for non-branded search terms of 30%. And maybe on their site they convert at a rate of 5%, which means that of the people searching for a term, they're maybe identifying leads at somewhere 1 to 2%. Now that's a huge leap in progress over what companies used to do. So it's not to diminish the importance of inbound marketing and the results that they can generate, but there's a huger opportunity, if you will, by knowing everything that's happening on the web outside of your own site, people that are looking for information. And buyer intent data is a huge opportunity in that space. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's happening, but at the end of the day, you're the MarTech whisperer. So kind of put a bow on this whole discussion and take us home, you know, as though you're talking to companies that say, okay, I've been listening, I buy the idea, we need to do this. Help us do it in a structured and productive way. What do you suggest to them?
Well, clearly there are a lot of exciting technologies that are coming into play, and over the next few years, as you mentioned, things are changing so fast that you really can't even imagine what will be available as AI and other technologies really take off. I think the danger there is the new shiny object, you know, as everyone calls it these days. So it's important not to just latch on to a technology because it's sexy, and then start talking about how you're the only AI-driven product in your space. I think I'm seeing that on an awful lot these days, and I wouldn't advise that. I think it's important still to stay home with what your value proposition is, and AI will help you get there. You know, think about it that way. And so just to add just a little bit more detail onto some of the things you talked about, AI is an interesting one because there's really a couple of different places where it's going to kind of revolutionize sales and marketing in particular. But the first one is productivity. You know, we've talked a lot about automation and the way you can leverage marketing automation, for example, to reach out to prospects and customers at just the right time. So this is going to get even easier and even more automated as AI comes to the game and starts to really look at customer data and make decisions on its own. So you really don't even need necessarily someone intervening and making decisions about when and where to send customer information. So that's something that's going to have a big impact on the industry as a whole, because, you know, you're going to need fewer and fewer people behind the tools in order to make those decisions. So my message there is that marketing and customer service professionals really need to focus more on strategy and on having human conversations, you know, things that machines really can't do, because pretty much everything else is going to be able to be automated. And then the other thing you mentioned is really super important, and that is all this data that's being gathered, you know, the big data sphere that's out there on everything we do, you know, and you may hate that idea, but it's happening whether you like it or not. So AI is really important to sort of make sense out of all of that data and make decisions quickly, so that engagements with websites, for example, or engagements with advertising are really driven by AI, and they're really driven by customer interests, not so much what you want to push out to the customer, but what the customer is actually looking for.
Right.
So this is really exciting, and I think it's going to completely also revolutionize sales and marketing and customer service. And then the last point I want to make is about digital communications, because that's already ubiquitous. We all have those devices. We're all using them most of the day to do everything we do. So it's incumbent upon good strategy, good sales and marketing and service strategy to leverage those channels. So you really need to think about the way you structure it. How how are you going to put people behind those chat bots and those text messages? How are you going to make those more conversational and personal and less like a robotic thing? So it may mean that we have to rethink the way our companies are structured. And ultimately, it may mean the end of the 9-to-5 workplace and the beginning of something far less structured, with people working all hours of the day and responsible for covering the gaps that, voicemail just doesn't cover.
Right.
So there's a lot of change to be thought about there, but that's our review of technology today. But as Ed mentioned, stay tuned because it's changing every single day. So thanks for joining us for some common sense. I'm John.
And I'm Ed.